What's crappin'? Stop yapping and build some shit. I am Cordell Rufus III. I'm going to walk you guys through how to rebuild your LS cylinder heads. Basically how to refresh them and upgrade the valve springs. If you're going for a high horsepower build, this would be... you can basically avoid the machine shop. Obviously, we're still going to send these heads out just to be decked, but we're just sending them out to be decked. So if you have a set of cylinder heads that are, we'll zoom you out here, that are, when you pull them off the engine, they look really nice. The first thing you want to do is double check your cylinder heads, make sure your valves are good and your heads are good. What you would generally want to do is when you pull them off, you can fill these ports with mineral spirits and just make sure your valves are at least sealing somewhat. I only had, and also when you pull the heads off, you can see in the actual cylinder whether that cylinder is a little bit, you can tell it's got a lot more deposits on the valves and everything. Usually that's a dead giveaway that that valve is probably not sealing right, and all the other ones are. This engine was really, really nice, but I did have an intake valve that wasn't sealing well, which caused just that particular port to be pretty bad. But all the other ports were really good. These cylinder heads were really nice when I got them. So take your time, use mineral spirits, clean the cylinder heads, clean the combustion engines, clean everything pretty good before you start. And then I'm going to walk you through just pulling the valve springs. This is all basic stuff that you can do at your house with the tools that you can get on Amazon. So what we're going to do is we're going to we're going to lap the valves, we're going to swap the valve springs, we're going to put in new valve seals, and that's pretty much all you really need to do to refresh your cylinder heads for really low money. So we're going to go through how you can do that, and then we'll be able to double check the heads afterwards and make sure they all still seal, but I'll also be able to show you kind of what the valves look like before and what they look like after with the lapping done. So this is a real cool, quick, not quick, but it'll take you a day to do all both cylinder heads, but it's well worth the effort considering the payoff in the end. And then after this, you basically would just need to get your cylinder heads decked at a machine shop, and that's pretty much it. So that's super cheap. So we'll go ahead and start walking you through all this stuff and what tools I'm using, and we'll get you through everything you need to know to be able to redo your cylinder heads and lap your valves in and have a fully awesome set of cylinder heads by the end. So this is an LY6 cylinder head off of a 6-liter LS. These heads are really, really nice. They flow almost as much as an LS3. So what we're going to do first is we're going to take off the valve springs off of this cylinder. You can see that I've already done these other cylinders, so I'm just going to walk you through this last cylinder, the whole process that I did on the other cylinders on this cylinder head. So we have this valve spring compressor and valve spring remover. It's from Bluegrass Performance. You can get these on Amazon. It's super simple to use. So it's got this little spacer right here. We're going to throw this on, and this just bolts on to where, bolts on to where your rocker arms normally go. So we're just going to throw those on there. They don't need to be tight with the ratchet. You're just going to run them down by hand with your socket. And that's how that guy goes on there. So that guy bolts right there, and then this post is what you're going to use to clamp down and put pressure on the actual valve springs, compress those, and we can pull out the keepers, and then we can get rid of the valve springs and pop the valves out. So I added a couple washers on top of mine because I was tired of running the nut down so far. But we're just going to run this nut all the way down. We're going to make sure this is centered on top of the valves. We're going to grab our ratchet and our socket, which I had all this stuff right here before we started. And somehow I started losing it. So that's what that looks like right now. So we're going to screw this down. We're going to compress those springs. And we really just need to compress them enough to get the keepers out. But what's going to happen is while you're pushing these down, you're going to be pushing the valve down also at the same time. So you're just going to turn this down to where the valves are pretty compressed, almost completely bottomed out here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip this up, and you can just take the backside of a hammer and you're going to knock these valves back into the seats. And that will free up your keepers on the back side. So now the keepers are out. They are back here, and we'll get rid of those. And then now we can back off the spring compressor, and we can pull off our springs. If you're going to do a job like this, you're going to want basically 1 can of carb cleaner per every 2 cylinders, so you're going to want 4 cans of carb cleaner at least. You're going to want to make sure that you don't end up with dirt or lapping paste behind the valve when you put the new springs in and you let the valve suck up back up into the seat. And you're also going to want to make sure you don't end up with a bunch of carbon deposits down in the valve guide when you swap over and remove the old valve seals, because there will be deposits on top of the old valve seals, especially on these old LS motors. I mean, these things have, you know, 200,000 miles on some of these things. This one was a 200,000 mile engine. And we're looking to make, you know, 1,500 horse, somewhere around 1,500, 1,600. So right now, we can just pop these valves out. So now these valves are free. We can get rid of these. Not get rid of them, but we're going to pull them out. And then we're going to pop off these valve seals. So when you remove the valve seals, it doesn't take much. You can use a normal pair of pliers and just pull them off. These valve seals actually have the lower spring perch incorporated into them, so that actually holds the seal down. So they're not really pressed on, at least not as pressed on as the new seals are. You can either take those seals out or leave them in for this. Sometimes it's nicer to leave them in just because it kind of makes for a more positive interaction between the drill motor and the valve. But if you have really old engines, it's usually best just to pop those out, just so you don't have the actual rubber of the seal rubbing on the valve stem, which causes some resistance in the valve, and then it makes the clutch on our little valve lapping tool that we have on the drill motor not really work as good. So I'm going to grab another can of carb cleaner. So now I'm just going to make sure that there's nothing inside the valve guide. And then we're going to flip this guy up, and we can start lapping valves essentially. So we're going to make sure we clean our valve seat area, just to make sure we get most of the stuff off there. And then also make sure we wipe down our valve. We have our large intake valve and our little exhaust valve. And if you look on these valves, you can see, especially on the intake valves, I don't know how well you guys can see that, but they're pretty pitted. They still do seal, but they're pretty pitted. And especially on the actual valve seat, there's some pitting also. The intake valves are usually really good, which they are. They're still good and shiny. Even the valve itself is still good and shiny, but the exhaust valves usually end up getting pitted just from the deposits kind of getting blown past that valve all the time and then getting smashed back into that valve seat. So now what we're going to do is we're going to just spray some penetrating lubricant on the actual valve guide in there. so that way we just have some level of lubricant while we're spinning this in there. Then we're going to grab our Permatex valve grinding compound. We're going to put some valve grinding compound on the actual valve. You can be pretty deliberate with this stuff. You don't need to go crazy. It's not really going to hurt if you have too much. We'll throw this guy back in there. So now that guy's in there. We can throw this valve in there also right now if we want. So we'll throw some lapping compound on this valve. A nice layer of paste. We'll throw that guy back in there. Now this is another tool you can get on Amazon. It's basically a clutch and then different size rubber pads depending on what valve you're using. So we have the larger pad on there now, which would be for your intake valve. We'll go ahead and use that right now. But you can hear the actual lapping compound when you start drilling. When you're spinning it, you can hear it grinding, and then the sound will go away after a couple rotations. That's when you want to lift the valve a little bit to suck more compound back in there and then drop it back down. So usually you'll do 10 or 20 of those where you let it spin until the sound goes away and you bring it back out and let the compound go back in. Let it go away, bring it back out. You want to do 10 or 20 of those depending on how bad your valves are. And if your suction cup, in this case, all these valves are used, so our suction cup is not really going to suction to these. So to pull it back out, usually you just push on the back of the valve with your finger. So we're just going to let this thing do all the work and spin the valve. And then we're just going to push on the back of the valve when we're ready and bring in more lapping paste. So I'm just spinning it, and then when I hear the noise go away, I'm just lifting the valve up with my finger from the back, letting it bring more paste in. You can hear it grinding, and then it's gone. Lift it back up, let it grind its way in again. So I would imagine that's probably good for the intake side. And then we can swap cups for the exhaust valve. That is our smaller valve. So we'll just pull that one off, pop that one on there, and now we're ready to do the exhaust valve. So we'll push that down on there just so it's got a little more surface area. This one's a lot louder. So you can hear how it's grinding and then it stops. Usually you can get away with 10 of them on the intake valves, and you want to do a little more on the exhaust to get rid of all the pitting. Okay, so I think that was about 20. So now we can pull these valves out, wipe them off. You want to make sure that you get all the compound out of the combustion chamber. So you can see right away all that pitting is gone where that seat is. all that pitting is gone. It's pretty flat now. And then also, here, we'll get this one out real quick. Wipe that one off, and then we'll spray these off. Whoa, definitely don't want to drop these valves. We'll spray those off, but first, we're gonna wipe as much of this out as we can. Okay, and then we're going to spray it out. So now, go back in there. Just make sure you get it all out. You just want to make sure it's not on the actual valve seat. Everything else is probably going to get blown out as soon as you start the engine for the first time. So let's blow off these. So now these valves are clean. So you can see the intake valve is obviously super shiny and lapped in really, really good. The exhaust valve, the exhaust valve is now pretty damn flat. So that should seal up nice, and then we are going to want to spray out these valve guides. And now that we have our valves done and lapped, all that stuff is good. So now what we need to do is install our new valve seals. So we're using Brian Tooley Racing products, so BTR. These are the 660 dual valve springs for our setup, and they come with valve seals. These are their valve seals, and these are going to have to be pressed on, and you're going to want to make sure you put down your valve keeper on the bottom, valve spring keeper on the bottom. You're going to want to make sure you put that down first before you put the seal in. So we're going to come over to the table over here. So what we're going to do, you're going to drop these down on top of your valve guides. Make sure there's nothing underneath them. We can grab 2 new BTR valve seals and just kind of push them on there by hand, just so they're sitting there. And then we're going to come up to the wooden bench over here, and we will press these on. So let me move the camera for you. So it's kind of hard to see exactly what's going on, but I'll do my best to kind of walk you through it. So if you're going to press these valve seals back in, you're going to want to put it on a solid area. If you try to do it on a folding table, you're not going to have a good positive feel. You won't know when it actually sets in, and it's a pain in the ass to get them to slide down on the valve guide. So you basically have this hoop on here. I should probably show you guys what this little... So this is also a BTR valve seal install kit. And where did that just go? Figures. So essentially this screws into the same spot that we screwed in the valve spring compressor tool, and then this has a counter bore in it that fits over the top of the valve seal, and you're just using this as a leverage point, and you can use what I have here is just a 3/8 socket extension, a couple of them put together. It gives me a little bit more leverage, and you're essentially just doing this with it to push it down, and that's going to push your valve seal back in there. So we're going to screw this thing in. Give it a few turns. You definitely do not want to tear those threads out. Make sure that it's down there as far as you can by hand, and that is straight. And then you're just going to give it some pressure and make sure to keep this straight as you go. So you're probably going to have to hold it. And you can hear it slide all the way down on there, and you're going to want to look in that valve seal, and you can see the valve guide is like maybe 20 thou below the actual top of the seal, and that's because there's a ridge on those valve seals. So that's as far down as that'll go. And if you're on a nice solid table, you can hear You can hear them slide down. We'll get this guy pushed down there as far as we can. And we'll make sure it's straight. You just want to make sure they're all the way in there. You get one shot. Once it's in the car, you ain't gonna fix it. So now both of those seals are in, and we'll move you back over to the other table so we can take a look at putting the rest of the stuff together. Bam! So now it's time to install the actual valve springs. So we're just going to grab two sets of dual valve springs. We're going to put those on top. You can grab our valve caps. I forget what they're called, the valve spring retainers. These are titanium, which is super rad. Then we can grab our compressor tool. So we're going to want to put this on here, just like we did before when we were taking them off. We're doing the exact same thing, except there's a couple other things we're going to want to do. Now we're going to want to just kind of give these just a little, so there's no slack in there at all, just because we don't want to put any pressure on those bolts with the added pressure from the springs. Now we can put the cap on there, throw the nut on. And we're going to tighten this down and compress these springs pretty far. We want to be able to have enough of the valve sticking out of the top where we can get the keepers on. So we're going to pop these down. You want to make sure that the valves are centered pretty close in there. It'll help you out not having to move them after. And we'll crank these springs all the way down. We're pretty close to all the way down. Now we can throw our valves in. So when you put in your valves, it's always nice to throw a little assembly lube on them. At least I do. Tip this guy up. I always spin them as I go in. It helps the assembly lube kind of get all the way in there. And the reason that valve's not going in all the way is because it's hitting the top of the spring, which is another reason why you want to make sure that they're pretty centered when you put them in there, but it's not a big deal. We'll just move it. And that one goes in fine, and you can make sure your valve is seating really well. So you can see right here our actual valve is actually hitting, so it's not making its way all the way through. The easiest thing to do is you just grab a screwdriver, and we're just going to push that over a little bit. And that's it. Now it'll pop through. So now we can throw our keepers on. Also, when you put on your valve keepers, that's another reason why it's nice to use the Royal Purple assembly lube, because it'll help keep the keepers on the actual valve while you're kind of setting everything up. So you're going to put the valve keeper on the valve on both sides. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to push the valve down by hand. So now that's sitting in there and the valve keepers are around it, and that's not going to fall out. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So that's got the keeper on the bottom, valve keeper on the top, and then we're just going to push it down by hand. So now the valves are pushed down by hand. The keepers are held in the keeper grooves on the actual valve. There's a space back here, so the valve is not actually sitting flat. We're going to let the springs pull the valves back in. Before you do that, you want to give these guys another quick spray so you know that there's not going to be anything stuck between the keeper, or excuse me, between the valve seal, the valve seat and the actual valve. So I always give them a good spray. And then now we can flip this guy over and start backing off this nut. And when we're backing off this nut, make sure you keep an eye on the keepers just to make sure they get nice and set in there. And now we can pretty much take all this stuff off. We're going to remove all this stuff. And what I like to do for good measure is just double check that everything moves, which is really hard to do with these springs. So those move up and down, and that's what that's pretty much all you got to do. So obviously after you get these done, you got the springs on there, the valves, you've lapped the valves are good, they're sealed. You'll probably want to double check. So what we'll do is, now that we have this whole cylinder head finished, you can take mineral spirits and put it in these ports on both sides and just let it sit for a while. You can let it sit for, 20 minutes, hour, half hour, whatever you want to do, and come back and make sure the mineral spirits are still in the valve, in the intake ports and exhaust ports. If you have like a major leak, it's going to basically drain out right away. Anything else is going to probably wear in as the engine runs. So generally what happens is your valve will actually spin a little bit as you run an engine, especially at high RPM. But so that's basically how you refresh your cylinder head. So you can see I obviously cleaned all this stuff really well before we started. That's a big thing you want to make sure you do. You do not want a bunch of crap going back into the seats while you're trying to lap valves and everything. But essentially, this thing can get final cleaned after we get it all decked, and then these heads are good to go. So you should be good to go. And hopefully you guys enjoyed that video and you like it, and share and subscribe and all that stupid stuff. Pretty cool. These heads should work really well. Obviously, if you follow the channel, you'll be able to see these cylinder heads on a 6-liter with a built bottom end on about 25-30 pounds of boost. So we'll see that in a little while. Pretty cool.